Hey everyone, it's Rob B here with Rob D, and this week we are bringing you an expert who's going to give us the best tips for working with a letting agent. Whether you self-manage or you like to use a letting agent, you are going to learn loads from this episode. There are some tips in here that I've never ever come across before that I will now start to implement. This is a true masterclass.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. Thank you for joining us for the show where we take some of the lessons that we've learned from doing over £100 million worth of property deals over every year and bring them to you for free. But today we're not just bringing you our own lessons. We've got a guest who, just like us, is on the front lines of property every single day, but in a completely different area. And I loved hearing his perspective. So you'll want to take some notes and stick around to the end for Hub Extra, where we've got a free tool for you that's going to revolutionize how you do your research.
So it's time for our news story of the week. Well, no, it isn't actually, because we are recording this before the budget. The budget is too close to the release date for us to cover it. But good news, people. Next week is the Market Update podcast, and we will have a budget special. So we'll bring you all the news from the budget, and we've got loads of other things to talk about as well. We will have a budget bonanza plus loads of other good stuff.
And, oh, what's that thud on the doormat? Well, if you're a magazine subscriber, then it's probably the Property Hub magazine landing with you. If you're not a subscriber, then I don't know what it is. Maybe you should go and check. But the Property Hub magazine is out now. If you are a subscriber, you will be very shortly reading a whole load of amazing case studies. I say it every time, but I really do think this one's the best yet. So many interesting projects for you to get inside. Also, my column in there is talking about why landlords could end up better off after the next general election. There's a contrarian opinion for you. And our location focus is on Wolverhampton. And if you feel the same way about Wolverhampton as most people, then you could be in for a surprise by the time you've read that. So if you're a subscriber already, then enjoy. If not, then you can still get access to that on all our previous back issues online if you subscribe at propertyhub.net/magazine. In the course of answering over 1,000 listener questions over the years on Ask Rob and Rob, and receiving a whole mailbag of questions for our weekly column in the Sunday Times, we get exposed to just about every issue you could possibly have with property. But the number one category we hear about by far is tenants and lettings. Because researching an area, finding a property, raising finance, going through that whole painful legal process, it's all super duper important, but it is literally just the beginning. If you want to get the benefit from your property asset, you need to be holding it for years and years. And that is years and years for things to go wrong and cause you hassle if you don't do things correctly. One option, of course, is to do it yourself. But the majority of investors use a letting agent. So we wanted to get a letting agent onto the show to find out what life is like from their perspective. How do you know if your agent's any good? How can you work with your agent to get the best out of them? And even if you're self-managing, what can you learn from how the best agents operate that you can pick up and start doing yourself?
Well, luckily we can answer all that because this week we have an expert on, and our guest today is Will Brandley. He's the co-founder of Slater and Brandley Lettings in Nottingham, and they specialise in property management. His team managed nearly 600 properties, and according to Google, they are Nottingham's best rated letting agents. They also do things like HMOs and serviced accommodation, so they're well placed to answer our questions today. So let's bring Will onto the show. Hi Will, thanks so much for joining us today. To kick things off, in your opinion, what would you say the most important things are a good letting agent will bring to the table?
For me, a letting agent bridges the gap between the landlord and the tenant, and ideally provides an impartial service to ensure that all parties are acting responsibly within the confines of the law. But not only this, a good letting agent brings knowledge and experience to landlords who either haven't got the time or the inclination to deep dive into how the process works. So a letting agent will ideally take away all of that pain and pressure for a landlord to understand the ins and outs of lettings. The top three things that make a good letting agent, I would say the first and perhaps most important would be communication. So how efficiently and quickly do both landlords and tenants get responded to? It's quite common for agents to only think about the landlord side of things, but the key to a healthy and long-term tenancy is to make sure that the tenants are also looked after. So we place a big emphasis on making sure that tenants are also responded to very quickly. And we do that through the use of technology and automations within the business. So when works are instructed, for example, both the landlord and the tenant get a notification of that. The same with appointments. So anytime we're going to go and do an inspection or a maintenance visit, our automation contacts the tenant and the landlord to let them know when that's happening. I would say how knowledgeable is the agent? So what level of experience do they have, and how do they keep on top of the changes with regards to compliance and any other amendments within the rental sector? And who can you speak with in the event that you're not happy? So every single one of our clients has access to my personal mobile number. It's on the footer of my email. And the idea behind that is that if they're not happy, or if they have any particular questions they want to ask me direct, they can call me as a founder of the business and speak to someone that's been doing this for a number of years. Now, luckily, I don't receive many of those calls, so that's hopefully a sign that we do things properly. I would say speed. So again, how quickly are maintenance issues responded to? It's one of the reasons that we brought maintenance in-house just over 2 years ago, in order that we had complete control over where we got to works, how quickly we could get to works. And also, if there was an emergency, we can pull a contractor off one job and send them straight to another, typically within the hour. So that's also really important. And then finally, I would say trust. So, is the agent a member of a regulatory body? How are they being kept and taken to task to make sure that actually they're following best practices? And particularly with accounts and money, do they have a ring-fenced client account, for instance? What kind of tenant is the agent letting to? We always stand by the notion that we would much rather a property be on the market for a few days longer in order to find the right tenant than just go with the first tenant that turns up at the door. We see many agents offering a promise to tenant a property within 24 to 48 hours. But more often than not, we find that the first tenant that turns up at the door isn't necessarily always going to be the best tenant. So you should always ask your agent how they go about finding their tenants. What kind of checks are they doing? Are they meeting the tenants at the properties? Because it can be much less costly to have a property empty for a few days to find the right tenant than it can to try and evict a bad tenant because they let to the first person that showed up at the door.
And what do you think separates a good letting agent from a bad one, or even just a mediocre one?
The first thing I would say is the relationships with both the landlords and the tenants. So a good letting agent will ensure that both landlords and tenants can build relationships, typically with one member of the team or a couple of members of the team. So what you find in our world is that there are large, let's say, corporate agents that operate centralized call center environments. So the idea here is that the landlord or the tenant calls the call center. They likely deal with somebody different every time they call, or sit on hold for kind of 5 or 10 minutes before they get through to somebody. And then when that person does pick up the phone, they're speaking to someone that might be based 100 miles away, and they can't visit the property. They never will visit the property. And so you have to ask yourself, when you're trying to explain things as either the landlord or the tenant, how well is that conversation going to go? How efficient is it going to be? And how does that then help to foster relations between the client and the agent? I would say accountability is really important. So it's probably not a common misconception that agents can be looked on quite negatively, but how will an agent react if something does go wrong? Will they try and sweep it under the carpet, or will they hold their hands up and then try and fix it? I would say their knowledge of compliance and the processes that they follow. So we regularly take on properties from agents who either don't have the correct knowledge to have been managing the properties, or they don't have the right processes in place to do so effectively. It's not uncommon for us to find that legally required certificates are missing, or inspections haven't been done, or in the case of HMOs, for example, that fire safety procedures simply haven't been followed. And that might not be as a result of inaction by the agent. It might just be a case of them not knowing how to do things properly. But obviously for the landlord, that can be very dangerous. And so it's important that the agent that you go with has a good, clear knowledge of processes and compliance, and is also updating their clients as well as to what things are changing within the rental sector to ensure that they can demonstrate that knowledge. And then finally, I would say a good letting agent will be very much focused on lettings. So a landlord should always look at the agent and say, okay, well, what kind of stock have they got on the market? How active are they in the sector? Or are they actually focused more on sales? Are they selling 10 times more properties than they're letting? Because with many agents, sales is the priority and lettings are the poor relation. And that can then lead to a lack of focus. So we'd always recommend looking for an agent that can demonstrate a very good level of activity within the letting sector. And the likelihood is that they've built a team around that, and they will therefore have the relevant knowledge and experience to be able to provide a good service.
So when you get a call from an experienced investor who's thinking of using your services, what kind of questions do they tend to ask to find out if you guys are up to the job?
We tend to find that the more experienced investors come to us in order to fix an issue. And that might be that they've perhaps managed the properties themselves for a period of time, but they're now becoming time poor, in which case we'll obviously need to demonstrate how we can then give them that time back. Some investors are unhappy with the current agent, so they'll often explain the frustrations that they have with their agent. And this can be down to a number of issues. But our job there is to explain to them how we differ. Again, that might be due to tenant relations. It might be due to a lack of communication. It might just be down to the tenant not reacting when they should. And other landlords might well just be finding it hard to keep up with legislation, the changes in the sector, and are perhaps tired of doing so. So in that case, we'll be asked questions about our understanding of the legislation, and it's up to us to make sure that we can answer those questions with the correct knowledge. Finally, we often work with investors who are simply looking to make their properties more cost efficient. So as landlords ourselves, and having done this for over 10 years now, we can often look at a property or portfolio of properties, including the finances, and explain to that landlord how perhaps we can either save them money or help them make more money in order to make that portfolio much more efficient. So we tend to find that questions from investors are typically surrounding those few things.
Okay, so imagine you start working with a new investor and they turn out to be your dream client. They are absolutely perfect. What does a dream client look like from your perspective as an agent?
A dream client for us is typically a client who responds quickly to our communication, especially when it comes to maintenance, for example. We stand by our promise to tenants as well that we want to respond quickly. If a maintenance problem arises, we want to get it resolved as quickly as we possibly can. Not only this, also understanding that owning rental property does come with costs. So landlords need to make allowances for those costs. And in our calculations as investors, we always outline an annual percentage cost for maintenance and voids. And if the numbers don't stack, we simply don't invest. It's quite simple. Unfortunately, we do see clients that make bad decisions when buying property and then realise that they don't actually have the funds to be able to maintain that property. And that can often lead to tough ongoing decisions when the investor realises that they aren't making any money. And we often find that in that case, we'll struggle to get responses for maintenance, for instance, or they don't want to spend the money that needs to be spent to actually maintain the property. So key to us is as I say, it's making sure that they understand that money needs to be spent on properties in order to maintain tenant relations. And generally speaking, a happy tenant is a long-term tenant, and everybody happy in that scenario is what we aim to do.
Okay, well, not to put you on the spot, but what about negotiating rates with potential letting agents? Ideally, what should investors be trying to achieve?
Our managed rates typically range between 8 and 12% plus that, depending on the level of work involved and the rental income for the property. So HMOs, for instance, require a much deeper level of attention. Additional visits are often required to HMOs for things like fire safety tests, for example. I would say any agent that's offering less than 8% is either going to be overloading their property managers with huge portfolios or cutting corners somewhere. And either way, that isn't good for the landlord or the tenant in most cases. And the landlord will end up paying for it at some point down the line, whether that be tenants leaving early or maintenance not being attended to quickly enough. Typically speaking, landlords with higher value properties or portfolios will be in a better position to negotiate the lower rates. This is because it's more efficient for a property manager to deal with one client that has multiple properties than it is with multiple clients with multiple properties. So as a landlord, what I would do is I would advise that you deep dive into the agent's services and understand where that value exchange is. A prime example of this is, what do inspections and inventories look like? So an agent offering a very low rate might just provide an inspection report, which is a one sheet of A4 document on Word with just a list of written text as to how the inspection went. A good agent will provide a proper written and photographic inspection report using real technology over multiple pages that details not only the condition of the property, but perhaps the safety side of things. So are there smoke detectors? Are there carbon monoxide detectors where required? So I would always look from a landlord's point of view at, first of all, the cost of the agent. But secondly, how does that then translate into the service that you're going to get as the landlord? Because going for the cheapest agent isn't always necessarily going to be the best decision. And you'll often find that actually the service levels reflect that. In terms of negotiation, as a landlord, I would look to sell yourself to the agent in one respect. How do you typically operate? How are you likely to respond to maintenance requests or other requests from the agent that need approval, for instance? As an agent, it's much easier and much more efficient to work with a responsive landlord, and perhaps a landlord who understands an element of the letting sector, because those conversations are often much more easier. And that's always going to be an appealing point for a letting agent. And therefore, you might then be able to negotiate better rates as a result of that.
I wouldn't want to be a letting agent today. There will be lots of listeners going out and trying to renegotiate their fees. That's really good information. So, of course, as an agent, you're going to have all kinds of property and you'll have seen it all. So from your experience, what are the best properties to manage? What causes you the least amount of hassle?
Quite simply put, the best properties for us to manage are those that have been kept in a good condition and are presented to a relatively modern standard. A 30-year-old kitchen is likely to need much more attention than, say, a 5-year-old kitchen. Not only this, but well-presented properties also tend to attract the best quality tenants, who in turn tend to be easier to work with and are likely to look after the property as if it were their own. Certainly, a relatively modern property or a property that's quite clearly been looked after by the landlord are going to be the best properties for us to kind of deal with.
We can probably guess from your last answer, but what type of property do you find is the most hassle?
The converse of that is tired and unkept properties. We tend to find that properties that are tired and unkept will generate a lower quality tenant. That in turn tends to mean that they won't look after the property as well, which then in turn leads to more maintenance, perhaps issues with arrears, non-payment, lack of communication, tenants preventing access in the event that we do need to try and get in, and generally sour relations, particularly when a landlord hasn't kept the property to a certain standard and then clearly doesn't want to keep the property to a certain standard. We can often find that we're chasing for repairs and maintenance to be done. And a bad landlord and tenant relationship generally tends to not go very well in the long term.
So if you do have a relationship that's not going very well and the investor's worst nightmare has come true, they're stuck with a problem tenant, what kind of action would you recommend they take?
So I would say the first thing to do is speak with somebody who has the experience of dealing with a problem tenant previously. How did they deal with it? What did they do to resolve the problems? And what was the process that they followed? What I wouldn't suggest is going onto a Facebook group and asking 1,000 people in the Facebook groups, because you're likely to get 100 different answers and 99 of them will be incorrect. We've used a number of different methods for dealing with problem tenants, and it really can depend on the circumstance. But a classic example is a non-paying tenant, for example. It's very easy as a landlord to look at a non-paying tenant and think, right, okay, I've got to follow the eviction process now. We all know that that can take months or years, but what other options are there in that circumstance? So as landlords ourselves, as counterproductive as it might seem, we've actually paid bad tenants to leave properties. Some will say, well, why would you do that? Why would you pay a tenant who clearly owes you money? Well, the answer is quite simple. So you can pay that tenant to leave. Maybe you say you give them £1,000 cash, for instance. Often a non-paying tenant isn't paying because they haven't got the money. And that money that you give them will give them the option and the opportunity to then move somewhere else. So no questions asked, pay the tenant to leave. What happens then is you end up with the property back. Rather than going through the process of eviction, which can take months and months and months, you get the property back as the landlord. You can then very quickly re-let the property and the problem's gone. What you don't end up with is months of arrears, as well as all the legal costs. We all know that solicitors can charge well and the court process is slow and laborious. So a classic example there would be to pay off the tenant, ask them to leave, get them out of the property, get it re-let and minimise the voids.
And finally, Will, to wrap things up, what can investors do if they're unhappy with their current letting agent? What course of action can they take?
I think there's quite a common misconception here amongst landlords that it can actually be quite difficult to change agents. But the reality is that it just isn't. So in our case, for example, a landlord can make one phone call to us. They can send one line email to their current agent to give them notice that they want to switch. And then we do absolutely everything else. So we'll then contact the agent. We'll advise them as to what we need from them. We'll arrange to visit their office, collect the keys, collect any paperwork, certificates, for example. What we'll then do is we'll then notify the tenant that the agent has changed. We'll go out and meet that tenant, sit down with them, explain to them how we operate and how we can hopefully make things more efficient for them moving forward. But that also gives us an opportunity to actually carry out an inspection at the property whilst we're there. Because generally speaking, a bad agent will often have either not inspected the property or not done a very good job when they have inspected it. And so we often turn up at that point and find either maintenance or evidence of tenants having not perhaps looked after the property as we would have expected. And so it gives us a really good opportunity to introduce ourselves to the tenants, but also provide a snapshot of the property on that day to the landlord. So the first thing I would do is ask the landlord to check the terms of the agreement with their current agent. Now, quite a lot of agents will include onerous cancellation clauses. So we've heard of agents wanting to charge the equivalent of 3 months' rent for landlords to leave them. I mean, even a month's rent, in my eyes, is way too much. But there are ways around this. Often when a landlord wants to change agent, it's because the agent isn't holding up their side of the bargain. So I would check those terms. What has the agent promised to do for the landlord? And have they followed through on their promises throughout that time? More often than not, that isn't the case. And that's the angle for the landlord to say to them, I'm giving you notice, I'm moving to another agent, you haven't upheld your end of the bargain, and therefore I'm cancelling the contract as a result of that. Once you've then spoken with the agent that you want to work with, advise them that you've done it, give them the details of your current agent, and let them take over and do the rest. It really is as simple as that. There should be no breaks in rent. There should be no issues with regards to the tenants. As long as the agent that you've chosen is the right agent and wants to do the right thing, it should be a very simple process. And once the notice period expires, you deal with the current agent moving forward. You will typically have a sole independent property manager that you build a relationship with, and then you go from there.
Again, thank you so much to Will for coming onto the show today. We will, of course, have his details in the show notes, but I loved hearing about life from his perspective. There were a few bits of real gold in there, but I'll tell you what I enjoyed most, because it backs up something that I've been saying a lot recently, and sometimes I feel like I'm going on about it too much, but this just gives me the confidence that it is really this important. It's that the good quality modern properties are the best ones to manage. It is the older and tireder ones that tend to cause the hassle. And the point that Will made, which I completely agree with, this is so true in my experience, is that that's not just because more things break in older properties, it's that you can't be as choosy about the tenant you take on. And that for me, Rob, is something that I certainly didn't appreciate in my first year or even my first 5 years of being an investor. It's something you only really see over time. But tenant selection is everything. If you get the tenant right, life is easy. But the only way to get tenant selection right is to get property selection right and have something that people are banging down your doors wanting to rent, because then you're in a position to be choosy.
You know what, Rob? This frustrates me a bit because I broke this rule. You know, you think after all these years, I would not be making these mistakes now, but something he said about prioritising quality over speed of tenant placements is so true. And that's what I compromised on. I took on a tenant that had a slightly iffy credit history, were given good stories to why that was the case by the letting agents, and it's been a nightmare ever since. The tenant didn't pay their first month's rent, then they eventually paid it, then they missed another payment. It's just been hassle from day one. Waiting another couple of weeks for the right tenant would have been the right thing to do. And that's me doing it after all these years. So if I'm doing it still, and hopefully I'll learn from that lesson and not do it again, and I've told myself I will not compromise again, but it just shows you how easy it is to fall into these simple traps. But those simple traps aren't shallow traps, they're deep traps, because when things go wrong, it's an absolute pain in the bum. And I don't get emotionally bothered by it. The reason why I'm bothered by this is because I knew. So I'm angry at myself, not the tenant, for this situation happening. But Will's laid out some simple rules here. And they are simple rules, but we don't always follow the simplicity. And it's easy to make those mistakes. However, not everything he said was simple, to be fair to Will, because one of the things I really liked and something I've never considered before is incentivizing problem tenants to leave. That's a really interesting concept, and after doing the podcast for all these years, that's something I personally have never done, and I have to say I don't know of anyone else who's done that as well. So that's a really interesting strategy, and according to Will, it seems to work. So that's a new one maybe to put in the strategy box of incentivizing problem tenants to leave. Not everyone will like that, and it won't sit comfortably with everyone, but sometimes it might be the right thing to do.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that you brought that up, because it's not necessarily something I would have expected a letting agent to suggest. Not that there's anything wrong with it. It's a very pragmatic solution. And maybe it's something we'll see more of when the Renters Reform Bill goes through and the legal process potentially becomes even more challenging. But I think it's a really good reminder that the legal process is a backstop. And if there's an alternative arrangement that both sides are happy with, then all good. I also like what he had to say about negotiating fees and really understanding what it is that you're paying for, which in my experience, looking through lots of questions for the Sunday Times, investors often don't. They haven't really read the terms of business. They don't know what they're signing up for. So really understand that, and then understand what value you're bringing as well. Because obviously, as a letting agent, one landlord with 5 properties is much more appealing than 5 landlords with 1 property. So if you can go out and negotiate, obviously, because this is a recurring fee, you'll be paying it every year for potentially a very long time. That one conversation has the potential to save you a lot of money.
It does, but it's worth repeating, and Will touched on this, that cheapest doesn't always mean best. So you might have a letting agent who's very willing to reduce their price, but if their service is not up to scratch, then in all honesty, you'd be better off managing the property yourself because you'll end up semi-managing it and paying for the privilege. So doing your research and making sure that the letting agent you choose is the very best in that area is such a key for success. And they may not negotiate with you, but if they are the best, it might be worth doing. And you see this with all services across the property industry, whether it be mortgage brokers, and you have some that don't charge anything and some that charge a fee, solicitors, and so on. Quality, for me, is the most important thing to establish and determine. And then, of course, you want the best price you can, but I'd be prepared to compromise on the price over compromising on the quality of the service, because each of these stakeholders in your property investment journey are so important to you having a good experience that sometimes it's worth paying a little more. But paying more doesn't automatically mean better as well, so that's why research is so important.
Okay, so you can negotiate with your letting agent, but we need to negotiate with you right now as well. Because we do something around here called the handshake deal, and it goes like this. If this is your first or second time listening to the show, you get a pass. But if you've listened more than that, we need something from you. You need to either go over to our YouTube channel and subscribe, or recommend the podcast to a friend. That is how we grow. That's how we reach more people. That's what motivates us to keep on turning up and doing this every single week. And it also makes it easier for us to bring on great guests like we have done today. So we've done our side of the deal. Now it's time for you to do yours. So if you can think of someone who would benefit from this podcast, send them our way. They can listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, anywhere. It's really easy. Or head over to YouTube, subscribe on there, and then you get an extra win because we've got great content every week on there as well. So Rob, I'm going to assume that everyone listening has just paused. They've gone and done one of those two things. So I think we're safe to carry on.
Well, let's carry on with adding more value then to your life. And this week, we're bringing you another AI tool. And AI is moving at such a pace that we could probably bring you a tool every single week. We won't because we like to mix it up. But I think this week, Rob, especially for our audience, this is an AI tool that everyone's going to want to hear about because it helps with research.
Yes, it does. I did some AI training for our team internally the other week, and one of the points that I made was that there are so many tools out there, it's really important to know which to use for which type of task. So ChatGPT obviously is a really good all-rounder. Google's Gemini is good at real-time stuff, and unsurprisingly, it's very good at stuff to do with Google's products. So I told our team to use that for anything to do with Google Analytics and stuff like that. Another tool to throw in the mix for research-type tasks is Perplexity, perplexity.ai. And there are two really cool things about this. One is that it has live access to the web, and so its knowledge is completely up to date. And the second is that for everything it tells you, it gives you the source. So obviously, hallucinations with AI, where it just goes off on one and starts making stuff up, is a real problem. If you're researching something and you want facts, that's a problem. But Perplexity gets around that. And if you're researching something a bit more serious, you can even tell it to focus just on academic papers. But what I've been using this for a bit is keeping up with what's going on in the news. Because if you want to know about something that's going on, you could go and look at it on like the BBC or a newspaper website, but that's only one perspective. If you use Perplexity, it can pull everything together in one place, and then it's got the chat interface. So if you've got questions about it, so like, what was the background to such and such? Then you can ask it and you can keep on the conversation. So it's like having a conversation with the news. So there is a paid version of this. I'm still just using the free one, which has got some kind of usage limitation, but I haven't come up against that limitation yet. And for me, Rob, it's just another nail in the coffin for Google. I've been using Google for search so much less over the last 6 months. And with Perplexity, it's just taken a whole other chunk of my search behavior and shifted it over to a new tool.
That's really interesting, Rob. The tool and your comments on Google as well. The tool I'll definitely be using. The comment on the nail in the coffin for Google, I'm not so sure. I think they're going to get their act together. And once they do, they're so powerful, they'll probably dominate everything again. We'll see, though. It could be a changing of the guard. But I think that's probably a different type of podcast and certainly not property themed. Maybe that's for one of our offline chats. So that's us done for another week. We will be back next week with a market update. So lots to update you on. There's so much happening with the property market right now. And it's panning out to be a really, really interesting year. So we will keep you up to date on all the latest news in the property market and the wider economy. So make sure you join us for that. Of course, we'll be back with Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday, and you can find us in the Sunday Times in the home section each and every Sunday, answering your questions there. So however you like to engage with us, we give you plenty of options. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.